to the mountain top without me. Don't go up there alone. Crazy people are getting stoned. Don't go up to the mountain top without me.
We drove for what seemed like an hour on an even worse road than we had been on, until we came to this old shack by a creek. And there, rocking on the front porch, was an old, leather-faced man called White Feather. Toby said he was a Cree Indian who had settled here before the land had been completely divided up and was supposed to be over 100 years old. We walked up to the porch, and Toby started to introduce us. But before he could finish his sentence, White Feather said, "I know these Oniga," slur for white man, "but since they are half-breeds, I'll talk to them." White Feather rocked slowly, with an old double-barrel rabbit-eared 12-gauge across his lap. I looked him in the eye and said, "Sir, you owe us an apology. We're not half-breeds, we're quarter-breeds." He cracked an almost toothless smile and motioned for us to sit. He said, "So you're here to ask about those evil walking wolf sons of bitches?" I looked at Tommy, wondering how he knew, but I said yes, we are. He began to tell us that they had been around since the beginning, but weren't always this damn big. He said that his people believed that the government had done experiments to make them bigger and meaner. They have stayed far away from us because we shared land with the hairy men who they feared. But now that the hairy men are no longer here as a deterrent, they are afraid of nothing. But I know you have many questions. The first thing I will tell you is this: to understand monsters, you must hunt them. To hunt monsters, you must understand them. How big are they? Where do they stay? How do you track them? How do you kill them? He responded, "The big ones get over 8 feet tall, and they can weigh up to 500 or 600 pounds. They can run as fast as a horse on all fours. They prefer deer and wild boar, but will eat anything, even us. They have huge, thick heads, but a high-powered, big bore rifle can kill them. They have a thick chest and back, but their sides are vulnerable. They love to open them big mouths and show their teeth. When they smile at you, put a load of double-aught buckshot right down their throat. If you can take out a knee on their rear legs, you will cripple it permanently. This can cause a big distraction because it will howl in terrible pain, and the others know they have to kill it. But most of all, they fear fire, and that's why people see them in water, along with trying to catch fish. During the fires, they ran to water, and when they are in water, especially above their waist, they are slow and clumsy. He pulled out a canvas bag and showed us a huge dog skull. This son of a bitch was in my creek one morning. I gasped at the size of it. They live in caves or burrow into brush-covered hillsides at the bottom of hollows, under a thick canopy and trees. They are hard to track because they can run so fast and jump so high and far. My father said they would jump over the teepees just to show how they could rip off the top with their long claws. They can smell blood a mile or more away. But what they cannot resist is the smell of organs like a heart or liver with fresh, warm blood. Their sense of smell can also be used against them by mixing the juice from hot peppers to squirt in their eyes and nose. A very high-pitched sound or whistle annoys them. My ancestors modified a flute to call them in and hurt their ears at close range. But always remember, they will know you are there, long before you know they are there, and they are far smarter than any dog or wolf. You must learn how they think and learn their travel patterns, just as your grandfather Grey Wolf did. You mean Grandpa Jack? I said. Then, our phones started blowing up. We had almost no cell service there, but the text said to get home ASAP. We thanked White Feather, and he told us, "May the Great Spirit Wolf follow you." As we got closer to Toby's house, we were able to call our folks. One of Aunt Elsie and Uncle Greg's prize horses had been attacked, and the veterinarian was there. Aunt Doris and Uncle Jim had lost another cow, and worst of all, their dog Spike had been killed. We also found out that Uncle Dan's chicken houses were broken into again, with several chickens killed or gone. I asked Toby if he or any of our folks here were planning to do anything. He simply said, "We are waiting on you." When we arrived at my dad's house, it was already late afternoon. I asked Tommy if he would go see Uncle Jim and look for tracks, and I would go see Uncle Greg because I wanted to talk to the veterinarian. We agreed to meet at Uncle Dan's chicken house later. When I went in the house, my mom and Jeannie were sitting at the kitchen table. They said Dad had already gone to see Greg and Elsie because Elsie was a total wreck. I asked how they were doing, and by the look on their faces, I got my answer. I was really worried about Mom because she had just gone through her last round of chemotherapy. I gave Jackie a big hug and asked him to show me what he was drawing. He was drawing a picture of my younger brother Max, flying his helicopter. I was really surprised because Jackie was barely 4 years old when Max died. I asked Jeannie if she would ride up to the A-frame with me, and she reluctantly agreed. When we rolled up, she instantly noticed the new doors and bars on the windows. She said, "Why are we here?" I told her I was getting my AR-10 and my .45 from the safe and going to see Uncle Greg. This was the first time we had been alone outside of Mom and Dad's house. She came close and we kissed. She smiled, and I asked if she would feel safe coming back here for a little date now, and she said, "Only during the day." We jumped in my truck, and I let her out at Dad's. Then I was off to Uncle Greg's. Dad, Greg, and the veterinarian were standing in front of the barn when I pulled up wearing my tactical vest with my weapon slung. I noticed Dad had his 12-gauge pump and .44 mag in a holster. Greg introduced me to Dr. Martin, who had been the vet in our area for most of my life. Doc said, "No intro needed. I know this young hero." "No, sir, not a hero, just a survivor," I said. He smiled and shook my hand, asking me to follow him into the barn, where he showed me Uncle Greg's prize, Appaloosa. There were huge bandages all over the horse's hindquarters and back, covering deep claw marks and gashes. There were also what he called canine bite marks on the back of the neck. Doc said he had only ever seen anything like this one time when a panther mauled a horse, but these claw marks were larger and deeper. I asked if the horse would be okay, and Doc said he thought so if we could prevent infection. So that's when I leveled with Doc and asked if he thought a wild hybrid dog/wolf did this, and if it's happening anywhere else. He looked at me, stone-faced, and said, "I see you have spoken to the elders." I raised my brow as he told me about the Scott family across the street, who were pig farmers and had lost a dozen or more pigs. Everybody knew the Scotts. They had about 300 acres where they grew corn, watermelons, beans, and all kinds of produce in addition to a small pig farm. My ex-wife, Jeannie, is one of the Scott girls, and she couldn't stand the smell of the pigs. My dad used to joke and say the only reason she married me was because I smelled a little better than the hogs. I asked Doc what he thought we ought to do, and he looked at me and said, "The question is, what are you and Tommy planning to do?" "First, I want Dad and I to go look for tracks," I said, and told him that Tommy was over at Uncle Dan's. Doc said he had taken some hair, blood, and saliva samples for testing, and part of a tooth he found. He had another call to go on, but would be in touch. Dad told Greg to go on in and tend to Elise while he and I looked around. Greg was a brilliant computer geek who had always dreamed of being a cowboy. Other than having a garden, neither he nor Aunt Elsie were hardcore country folks like the rest of us. Elsie had met Greg in college, and they were really into the fraternity/sorority lifestyle. I think that soft, cushy life and being around all those urban-dwelling kids was what led Tim down the wrong road. He first got hooked on drugs and then started selling to support his habit. As Dad and I started looking around the barn, the sun was already getting low. He said, "Son, I don't feel good about us being out here with it getting dark." I agreed and said, "Let's stick close and keep our heads on a swivel, and we won't go any further than the creek." We followed what appeared to be some faint tracks and a few drops of blood down to the creek, where all signs disappeared. I think we looked at each other and both had the same idea. He said that the Viet Cong used to loop a rope over a tree branch on the other side of a creek and swing across so there would be no muddy footprints. "There ain't no ropes here, so let's get wet," I said. We cautiously crossed the creek, and on the other side, we found tracks where something had landed hard and left the biggest freaking dog or wolf tracks I ever saw in my life. That was about a 30-foot jump, and the tracks faded as they led up into the thicket. I pulled out my cell and took the best pictures I could. And Dad said, "I'm uneasy. Let's book it." On the way out, I suggested we meet up with Tommy at Uncle Dan's to see what he had found. When we arrived at Dan's place, it was almost dark, but there stood Tommy, Dan, and Tim. Something had ripped through a window and helped itself to about a dozen or more chickens. Tommy said he and Uncle Dan had followed some partial tracks and feathers about 100 yards into the tree line, where it looked like a grand chicken feast had occurred. Tim had stayed behind to nail up plywood over the windows. "Hey Tim, how's it going?" I said. He was obviously a little shaken. He told me about how he had only had to serve 6 months of his sentence, and the Department of Corrections paroled him for being a model prisoner. He was ashamed of what he had done and bringing shame to the family. I told him that if it wasn't for second chances, none of us would be here. He smiled and gave me a big hug. I think he thought I had judged or condemned him. I asked Dad if he was still current with his pilot's license, and he said yes. I suggested we rent that old Cub he used to take Max and I up in. "What's on your mind?" he said. "Recon," I said, and we agreed to head out to the airport first thing in the morning. That night, Mom, Dad, Jeannie, and I spent some good time talking while Jackie played. Mom said she felt so much better with me home, along with Jackie and Jeannie in the house. I asked if the cancer was in remission, and she said we would know tomorrow. She asked how Jeannie and I were doing, and I told her that we were happy to be sharing time together with Jackie. She looked over at Jeannie and reminded her that she was always like another daughter to her. They hugged and began to chat because Jeannie would drive Mom to her doctor appointment tomorrow, and Jackie would spend the day with Jeannie's parents across the road. I said, "Dad, tomorrow the pack starts getting ready for a hunt." That's when the phone rang, and Sheriff Wills told Dad they had found the mangled body of the missing game warden. He said that an SAR unit was dispatched from Fort Bragg, and they had found the body about halfway down Black Creek Valley. I told Dad I would be calling a friend at Fort Bragg tomorrow. Dad and I arrived at the small county airport at 0800 hours, and there stood old Marvin, the airport manager and owner of a few aircraft stationed there. Marvin gave me a hug and said, "Welcome home." I hadn't seen him since Max's funeral, and he seemed so happy to see us. We briefly chatted about what had been going on, and he said he had initially participated in the air search until all civil aviation aircraft were ordered out of the area by the FAA. He said that 2 Black Hawks and a Chinook had landed here for fuel, and all they would say is that they were asked by the suits to participate in the search. Marvin said he bet the suits were some damn alphabet agency with a secret agenda. Anyways, you boys flying for pleasure or business? He said. A little of both, I said, as he noticed we were both carrying sidearms, and I had a rifle case slung over my shoulder. He then reminded us that discharging a firearm from a civil aviation aircraft was a violation of federal law without the proper permits, and smiled. We both nodded, and he handed us the key. After a quick pre-flight, we were airborne. I always loved flying low and slow over these hills and streams, but the fire had devastated the beautiful scenery. Dad was pilot in command, and I held a topo map in my lap. We rolled in over our family land and made our way from Uncle Greg's over to Dan and Roger's place. Dad had that cub slowed to where the stall warning would occasionally squeak. Dad, take us over that power line right of way that cuts across Dan and Roger's grazing land, I said. We followed that right of way across the river to where it made a slight turn, skirting Black Creek Valley. Well, I'll be damned. That right of way dodges Black Creek, Dad said. I agreed, and said that it should have at least cut right through the upper 1/3 of it. I asked if he could take us down low and slow, and fly us NOE back toward the river. We were both trying to look for any clue we could see, when there it was, plain as day, a pile of animal carcasses just before the river. I asked Dad to circle around it as low as possible while I took some bearings, when Dad shouted, Look at that son of a bitch." In the tree line, standing on its hind legs about 50 or 60 feet from the bone pile, was the biggest, blackest dog/wolf I had ever seen. It had to be about 7 or 8 feet tall. I asked him to widen our orbit just long enough for me to aim my rifle. I scoped that ugly son of a bitch, and I put a bullet right where its neck met its chest. It fell instantly, without a sound. I took some pics with my zoom, and asked Dad to take us up higher to look for trails leading off from the bone pile. As we climbed, we started to hear growling and howling over the sound of the propeller and engine noise. By the time we had gained about 200 feet, there were about 5 or 6 more of those things raising hell and climbing trees like they were coming up after us. Dad said, "Son, don't shoot any more of those damn things. I got a bad feeling about this. Let's get the hell out of here." After the adrenaline slowed down, I noticed some missed texts and calls from Toby Thunder. When I got him on the phone, he was frantic. He said, "Get here quick. Something killed the elders." As I hung up and told Dad, I noticed he was flying due north, throttle to the firewall, away from the spot. "What the fuck?" I said. He said he was using an old trick to lead the enemy away so they wouldn't follow us back. I was damn glad my dad was pilot in command. After about a 15-minute detour, we landed back at the airport, where Marvin told us that something big had happened north of the Devil's Elbow. We didn't mention what had just happened to us. After we got into Dad's truck, he saw 3 missed calls from Uncle Dan, Uncle Roger, and Sheriff Wills. I also had a missed call from Tommy. The sheriff wanted to form a search party to meet at the lodge, ASAP. When we rolled into Dad's driveway, there was a yard full of cars and trucks. There was Uncle Dan, Tommy, his youngest son, Alex, the lawyer, Uncle Greg, Tim, Bobby, Uncle Jim, Marty, Uncle Roger, and Arthur. The pack was definitely back. It was already about 12:30 p.m., and everybody was clamoring and looking at me like, what do we do now? I remember thinking that Uncle Greg and Tim don't need to go with us. I easily convinced Tim that he and Sally needed to hang around and take care of the place. I told Uncle Greg that we needed his computer expertise to research why the power line right-of-way skirted Black Creek and to see if he could come up with a way to create a computerized, high-pitched sound weapon. He lit up at those two challenges. Jeannie stopped me at the door and said, "It seems like we've been here before, but at least your mom got a good report from the doctor." "Great, but don't worry. Everything will be all right," I said. Then we headed out to the lodge.